My daughter told me the wedding would be smaller this year. Intimate, she said, just close friends and family. When I asked if that meant I'd finally get to meet Donovan's parents, she went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with a bad connection. Then she said, very carefully, "Dad, maybe it would be better if I sat this one out." I've been a forensic accountant for 31 years. I know when numbers don't add up. And I know when a person is reading from a script someone else wrote. So I drove to Portland. My name is not important. What matters is that I am 64 years old. I spent 3 decades following money through shell corporations and ghost ledgers and the private accounts of people who believe they were too clever to get caught. And I raised my daughter alone after her mother passed when she was 11. I taught her to ride a bike in the parking lot of a shuttered Sears. I stayed up until 2 in the morning helping her study for the bar exam she wasn't sure she'd pass. I watched her walk across that stage and felt something so full it almost hurt. Her name is Avery. She's 33, and for the past 8 months, she has been slowly, methodically erasing me from her life. It started in October. She called to say she'd met someone. His name was Donovan, and she said it the way you say a word you've been practicing, with a kind of deliberate care, like she was testing whether the sound of it would give something away. He was in private equity, she told me. His family had been in Boston for generations. Old money, she said, and there was something in her voice when she said it. Not pride exactly, more like warning. I asked when I'd meet him. She said soon. Soon became November. November became January. By February, she was engaged, and I found out from a photograph she posted online, a ring on her finger, his arm around her shoulders, both of them squinting into some coastal light. I called to congratulate her, and she answered on the 4th ring, already managing me, already working around the edges of something she didn't want me to see. I asked again about meeting Donovan. She said his family had a lot of opinions about how things were done. Traditions. She used the word traditions like it was a shield. I didn't push. I am a patient man. 31 years in forensic accounting teaches you that patience is not passive. It's a posture. You wait and you watch, and you let the other side reveal itself. By April, the excuses had taken on a texture I recognized. Too polished, too consistent. Real excuses are messy, improvised. They contradict themselves. Hers had the structural integrity of something rehearsed. His family was very private. The wedding planning was consuming everything. Donovan's father, she told me once, ran things in a very particular way, and she was still learning the rhythms of it all. I stored that away. Then came the call I hadn't prepared for. It was a Sunday. I was sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold, going through an old case file I'd been asked to consult on. A municipal pension fund audit with some irregular disbursements I couldn't quite make sense of. Avery called, and before she even spoke, I could hear the tension in the silence before her words, the held breath. The slight catch. "Dad," she said, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear me out before you respond." I set down the file. "Okay," I said. She had this speech prepared. I could feel the seams of it, the places she'd gone back and revised, the parts she'd probably said out loud to herself in the car. She told me that Donovan's family was very image-conscious, that they had a reputation in certain circles, that the guest list for the wedding had to be carefully curated, and that there were people, advisors, partners, colleagues, whose presence mattered enormously to Donovan's father. She said it in the way people say things when they're trying to make cruelty sound administrative, and then she said, "Dad, I think it would be better for everyone if you weren't there." I didn't say anything. She kept going, filling my silence with more of the script. She said it wasn't about me. She said it was just the way things had to be right now. She said Donovan's family had a very specific vision for the day, and that she paused here, introducing complications would make things harder for her. Complications. I was a complication. 33 years of being her father, and I was a complication. I told her I understood. I thanked her for telling me. I said goodbye, and I set the phone down on the table next to the cold coffee and the audit file, and I sat there for a long time looking at nothing in particular. I didn't cry. I'm not sure why. The grief was there, a real physical weight somewhere under my sternum, but underneath it, or maybe alongside it, something else was happening. The same quiet ignition that happens when a number is wrong, and you can't yet see why, but you know that if you follow it far enough, you'll find what's been hiding. She was afraid of something. Not of me, for me, maybe, or because of something I didn't yet know. But fear was in that call, threaded through every rehearsed sentence. And whatever she was afraid of, it was big enough that she would rather lose me than let me close to it. I opened my laptop, I typed the name Donovan into the search bar, and then I stopped, because I didn't know his last name. She had never once told me his last name. That was when I knew for certain that this was no longer about social class. I called my oldest friend the next morning. His name is Roland Fitch. We went to college together. We were in each other's weddings. We've kept each other upright through the kinds of losses that make everything else look small. He spent 22 years as a federal investigator before he went private. He now runs a consulting firm that does the kind of due diligence that wealthy families hire people to do on other wealthy families. He knows how to find things. I told him everything. He listened the way he always listens, without interrupting, without performing sympathy, just taking it in. When I finished, there was a short silence. Then he said, "You don't know his last name." "No," I said. "She's been with him for 8 months, and you've never been told his last name." "I know," I said. Another silence. Then, "Give me a day." Roland called back in 18 hours, he said. "Sit down, Ray." He only calls me Ray when it's serious. "My name is Raymond. The man your daughter is marrying is Donovan Haas. His father is Gerald Haas. Does that name mean anything to you?" It didn't. Not at first. Then Roland told me what Gerald Haas did, and something cold moved through me that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. Gerald Haas ran a private investment group called Archpoint Capital. Based in Boston, operating across the Northeast, he had been managing money for high-net-worth individuals and institutional investors for over 2 decades, with a reputation built on discretion, consistency, and returns that seemed almost impossibly steady regardless of market conditions. Roland pulled his last 3 annual investor reports. The language in them was confident, polished, the kind of language that smelled, to a man who'd spent 30 years auditing things, like it had been written to be believed rather than understood. But it wasn't the language that stopped me. It was the construction projects. Archpoint had branched into real estate development in the last several years. Roland had found prospectuses for 4 major projects: a waterfront hotel in Portsmouth, a mixed-use development in Providence, a luxury residential tower in Hartford, and a sprawling resort community outside Portland. All of them were described in the kind of breathless detail that developers use when they need investors to feel something before they start thinking. All of them had projected completion dates that had already passed. I asked Roland to send me the files. He did, and then I stayed up until 4 in the morning. I know buildings. Not the way an architect knows them. Not the beauty of them, the geometry, the way light falls through a certain angle of glass. I know them the way an auditor knows them, as assets, as liabilities, as the kinds of things that are easy to promise and difficult to fake for very long. You can fake a balance sheet indefinitely if you know what you're doing. You cannot fake a building. A building either exists or it doesn't, and the process of building it, the permits, the inspections, the payroll, the supply chains, leaves a paper trail so dense and specific that hiding it completely is almost impossible. I went to the county permit databases for Portsmouth, Providence, Hartford, and the township outside Portland. I searched for construction permits tied to the addresses listed in Haas's prospectuses. The waterfront hotel in Portsmouth, one preliminary site assessment permit filed 18 months ago. Nothing since. The mixed-use development in Providence, 2 permits, a demolition permit for the existing structure, and an initial foundation permit. The foundation permit had an inspection flag on it from 14 months ago, marked unresolved. The Hartford Tower, no permits at all. Not a single document in the public record. The resort outside Portland, I found a zoning variance application from 2 years ago. It had been denied. I sat back in my chair. Outside my window, the city was doing whatever cities do at 4 in the morning, humming, breathing, moving in its slow and largely invisible way. I thought about the investors whose money had gone into those 4 projects. I thought about what their most recent statements showed and what those statements were based on. I thought about the waterfront hotel that didn't exist, and the tower with no permits, and the resort that had been denied the right to be built. Then I thought about my daughter standing in a white dress, in a room full of the people who had been told those buildings were nearly finished. I called Roland at 7. He was already awake. He said, "I found the same thing." We talked for 2 hours. The picture that assembled itself as we talked was not complicated, which is sometimes the most frightening kind. It was a simple machine, built to do one thing: gather money, show fictional returns to keep the money flowing, and gather more money. The projects were props. The returns were circulated funds. The whole structure worked for as long as new investors came in faster than old investors asked questions. But the math on these things always runs out eventually. Roland had pulled some financial filings, nothing confidential, just public records, and he said the trajectory was clear. Archpoint's capital base had been declining for at least 18 months. The investor reports were still showing steady returns, but the cash position in the underlying entities told a different story. Gerald Haas was running out of time, which meant he needed one last performance, one final spectacular demonstration of legitimacy and permanence and wealth so overwhelming that the remaining hesitant investors would commit before they thought too carefully about what they were committing to. "A wedding at the Langham Boston," I said. Roland was quiet for a moment. Then, "How did you know it was there?" "Avery mentioned it once," I said. "She said the venue had a certain history. She said Donovan's father had been very specific about it." "Of course he had. The Langham is not just a hotel, it is a statement. A century of accumulated significance, the kind of place where powerful people feel comfortable being seen." If Gerald Haas was going to make his final pitch to the investors who still believed in him, he wasn't going to do it at a Holiday Inn. "The guest list," Roland said. I managed to get a partial look. He read me several names. I recognized 2 of them from the pension fund audit sitting on my kitchen table, the one I had been brought in to consult on, the one with the irregular disbursements I couldn't quite trace. Both names were connected to funds that had significant exposure to Northeast real estate development. My stomach dropped. "These weren't just Haas's investors," I said. "Some of these people are already overexposed. If Archpoint collapses..." "It won't just be Haas's people," Roland confirmed. "It'll ripple. Some of these funds have beneficiaries who don't even know what they're invested in." I sat with that for a while. Avery's voice came back to me. The rehearsed speech. The word complications. She was protecting something, or she thought she was. But she didn't know what she was standing in the middle of. She couldn't. Because if she knew, she wouldn't still be standing there. I raised her better than that. I have to believe I raised her better than that. The wedding was in 9 days. We had everything and nothing. What we had was enough to convince any reasonable person of what was happening. What we didn't have was time for any reasonable institution to act on it. Roland had a contact at the SEC, a woman he'd worked with on 2 previous cases, sharp and thorough and deeply trustworthy. He called her. She said what Roland already knew she'd say. The documentation was compelling. The case was serious, and the timeline was impossible. By the time subpoenas were issued and servers were preserved and the legal architecture of an investigation was properly erected, the wedding would be 3 weeks in the past, and Gerald Haas would be wherever Gerald Haas had planned to go. So we did what we could with what we had. Roland knew a woman named Petra Sundstrom. She was 71 years old, a former partner at one of the 3 or 4 most respected investment firms in New England, and she had retired with a reputation so immaculate that her opinion on a financial matter carried more weight in certain rooms than a court order. She was also, Roland told me, deeply and specifically contemptuous of fraud. She had lost her father to a Ponzi scheme when she was in her 30s. Lost him not to death, but to the particular kind of annihilation that comes when a man's life savings and his self-respect disappear in the same moment. She took this personally, Roland said. She always had. Roland called her. He laid out what we'd found. She was quiet for a long time after he finished, and then she said, "What do you need from me?" We needed her to go to the wedding. She was not on the guest list. She pointed this out. "We know," Roland said. There was another pause. Then she said, "I'll get myself on it. I know one of the investors attending. I'll make sure he brings me as his guest. How much time will I have?" "As much as the cocktail hour gives you," Roland said. She said that was enough. The night before the wedding, Roland and I sat in my rental car outside the Langham and went over everything one more time. I had put together a summary, not the full documentation, which would take hours to absorb, but a 12-page distillation that moved from the simplest facts to the most damning ones in a progression designed to be understood in under 15 minutes. I'd formatted it to look like a routine investment review. Nothing alarming on the outside, everything alarming within. We printed 3 copies. Roland took one. Petra Sundstrom would receive one at the cocktail hour, passed from Roland's hand to hers in the way that people at events like this pass things, like it's nothing, like it's incidental. And I kept one. I got into the Langham through the service entrance at 2 in the afternoon. I had called the hotel's event coordinator 3 days earlier, identifying myself as a consultant, brought in to assist with large-scale event logistics. Not entirely untrue. I had spent 6 months consulting for a hotel group in my 50s, and I knew enough of the language and the rhythm to be convincing. I said I'd been asked to do a final walkthrough of the service coordination. The coordinator was managing 11 events that week. She said yes, someone would let me in, and left a note with my name at the service entrance. I wore a dark suit, nondescript, the kind of suit that could belong to anyone. The ballroom was everything I'd expected, and then some. High ceilings, a long swath of windows looking onto Federal Street, flowers in quantities that seemed almost aggressive. The whole room was arranged to signal abundance. Not warmth, not joy, but abundance. This was a room designed to make a certain kind of person feel a certain kind of security. I recognized the intention the way I recognize a number that's been placed to distract from another number. The guests arrived at 6. I positioned myself near the entrance to the secondary ballroom, where the cocktail hour was being held, moving slowly with a tablet in my hand, as though I was monitoring something. No one looked at me. People at events like this don't look at the people holding tablets near the service areas. I was invisible in plain sight. I watched Gerald Haas work the rune. He was shorter than I'd imagined, compact, precise in his movements, with a full head of silver hair and a handshake that he deployed with surgical regularity. He moved from cluster to cluster with the fluency of a man who has spent 50 years in rooms like this one, who knows exactly how long to stay and exactly what to say and exactly what to say and exactly when to laugh. He was performing wealth and stability and confidence the way some people perform grief, so thoroughly that it became a kind of truth in the room, at least for a while. His son was beside Avery, across the space. Donovan was handsome in the way of men whose handsomeness has always worked for them a little too easy, a little too practiced. He held my daughter's hand and leaned toward her when she spoke and refilled her glass when it was low. I watched him. When she turned to speak to someone else, the expression on his face shifted in the fraction of a second it took for her to look away, going from warm and attentive to something else, something flatter and more private. Then it snapped back the moment she turned toward him again. My daughter, she was wearing a dress the color of winter light. She looked radiant and exhausted in equal measure. Her smile was real some of the time, and constructed the rest of the time. And I know the difference because I've watched that face for 33 years. She was holding herself together with the controlled effort of someone who has decided that holding together is the only option available to her. I stood near a column and I looked at her and I thought, she doesn't know. She's not part of this. Whatever she's been told about why I couldn't be here, she believes it's necessary. She has convinced herself that this is the price of the life she's building, and she's paying it because she doesn't yet understand what the life costs. That was the thought that made everything else simple. Roland found me near the bar at 6:40. He passed me a glass of sparkling water I hadn't asked for, and said, very quietly, without looking at me, "Petra has it. She's talking to Calloway right now." Calloway was one of the names from the pension audit, one of the names Roland had flagged as significantly exposed. I said, "And you?" He said, "I found the one I was looking for." I asked if he needed the third copy. He said, "Keep it. You'll know when." He moved away. I went back to watching the room. At 7:15, Gerald Haas moved toward a corner of the cocktail space where 3 men were standing. Older men, the kind of men who hold their drinks loosely because they've never had to hold anything tightly. I watched Haas approach them and the whole geometry of the group shift slightly to accommodate him, the way a group accommodates someone who's expected. He shook hands. He laughed at something. He put a hand briefly on one man's arm. He was selling. The thing about a good con is that the selling is invisible. It doesn't look like selling. It looks like confidence, like generosity, like the natural overflow of a man who simply has too much good fortune not to share some of it. Gerald Haas was very good. I watched him work those 3 men, and I understood, in a way that was almost academic, why people believed him. Then I watched one of the 3 men check his phone, not casually. The way a person checks their phone when they've received something that changes the weight of the room. He looked at the screen, and then he looked up. His eyes went briefly to Gerald Haas, and then down again. He said something to the man beside him, low, not looking up from the phone, and that man reached into his pocket for his own phone. Petra had moved. The ripple happened quietly. That's the thing people don't understand about the collapse of trust in a room. It doesn't announce itself. It travels through the group like a change in air pressure, something you feel before you understand. Conversations didn't stop. Voices didn't raise, but the orientation of the room shifted, almost imperceptibly, away from the center where Gerald Haas stood. One of the 3 men excused himself. He walked toward the corridor that led to the lobby, already dialing. Haas watched him go. Something moved across his face. A brief recalibration. A professional assessment. And then the performance resumed. But I could see now that he was scanning the room, looking for something that wasn't where he'd expected it to be. I walked toward my daughter. I didn't approach from the front. I came up beside her, close enough that she heard my voice before she saw my face, and what I said was simply her name. She turned. Her face did something complicated. Shock first, then a whole sequence of things happening too fast for me to name, and then her eyes filled. "Dad," she said. Her voice was very small. "What are you doing here?" I said, "I need you to come with me for a few minutes." She looked across the room toward Donovan. He was talking to someone, his back to us. "Avery," I said. "Please." She looked at me for a long moment. Then she nodded, once, and she followed me into the corridor. We stood near a window that looked out on the street. The city moved below us, indifferent and constant. I took the folder from inside my jacket and I held it out to her. "I need you to read the first 3 pages," I said. "Just the first 3. Then tell me what you want to do." She took it. She looked at the cover. It looked like nothing, just a document. And then she looked at me, and I could see her trying to decide whether to be angry. Then she opened it. She read slowly at first, then faster. I watched her face the same way I'd watched Marcus Harrison's across the ballroom of a different hotel in a different story I'd once read about. No, that wasn't right. This was my own life. I watched my daughter's face the way only a father can, reading every micro-movement of recognition and dread. On page 2 she stopped. She looked up at me. "Dad," she said. "Dad, what is the permits or public record?" I said. "The accounts are documented. Roland found the transfers. It's all there." She looked back down. She read page 3. When she looked up again, the color had left her face. "Did Donovan know?" she asked. "I don't know," I said. "I think his father kept him close enough to be useful and far enough away to be deniable." Her eyes went back to the ballroom door. Through the glass, I could see the edge of the space, the flowers, the pale gleam of the chandeliers. Somewhere in there, her fiancé was refilling his drink. Still innocent or not, Still the man she thought she loved or something adjacent to it. I didn't know, she said. The way she said it wasn't a defense. It was just a statement of fact, needing to be said out loud so she could hear it herself. I know, I said. She was quiet for a moment. Then, all those people in there. All those people in there. All those people, I said. She looked at the folder in her hands. Then she straightened up, and something settled in her face that I had seen before, the night before the bar exam, when she'd looked at the mountain of material she still had to review and decided to climb it anyway. A kind of quiet reckoning. She handed the folder back to me and said, "What do we do?" I said, "Roland and Petra are already doing it. The room is already changing. We don't have to do anything except leave." She looked toward the ballroom one more time. For a long time. Then she said, "Let me get my coat." We didn't make a scene. There was no confrontation, no moment where I faced Gerald Haas across a crowded room and delivered the verdict. That's not how this kind of thing works. The truth doesn't usually arrive with drama. It arrives the way Roland described it to me once. After a case we worked years ago, quietly and from multiple directions at once, so that by the time the person in the center of it realizes what's happening, there's nowhere to turn. By the time Avery and I walked out of the Langham, 3 of Gerald Haas's expected investors had already made calls. One of them, I learned later, had a direct line to someone at the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit in Boston who had been looking for exactly this kind of document for 11 months. The call took 4 minutes. Gerald Haas was arrested 4 days after the wedding that didn't happen. The charges were extensive. The investigation that followed uncovered losses across 14 states and more than 200 individual investors. Some of them would recover most of what they had lost. Some of them wouldn't. Donovan. I still don't know exactly what Donovan knew. His lawyer has been working hard to establish the distance between father and son. Maybe that's honest. Maybe it isn't. That's for other people to determine now. What I know is this. 3 weeks after the Langham, Avery came to stay with me for a weekend. She slept in her old room with the window that sticks in July, and the view of the neighbor's elm tree that she used to climb when she was small and reckless. We didn't talk much about what had happened. Not yet. Those conversations are long, and they deserve more than a weekend. Instead, we ordered pizza, and we watched an old movie she'd always liked, and at some point she fell asleep on the couch with her feet tucked under her and her face completely still and unguarded. I sat in the armchair across from her, and I thought about all the things I'd spent 31 years following, the numbers that didn't balance, the trails that doubled back, the careful constructions of people who believed that if they built the lie large enough, it would hold its own weight forever. I thought about how none of that, not a single case, had ever mattered to me the way this one did, not because the fraud was larger or the consequences more severe, but because the person who had almost been swallowed by it was someone I had watched take her first steps on the hardwood floor of the house I no longer owned, in a city I no longer lived in a version of our lives that felt, on that particular Saturday night, very close and very clear. She stirred slightly in her sleep. I got up and got a blanket from the hall closet and put it over her. I went back to my chair. I picked up the cold cup of coffee that had been sitting on the end table since before she'd arrived, and I drank it, and I sat with her while she slept, and that was enough. That was more than enough.